If you think of the holodeck on Star Trek The Next Generation, it's like a room maybe this size, for those that don't know, where it can create any environment and it feels real, like these chairs would feel real, but they were created by the AI. And how do you program that holodeck, or how did they program it? Well, it turns out they just talked to the computer. And before, we couldn't really think how to do that, because I remember thinking, well, that's not a program. The program is, but now we can with prompts. So there's a whole new flavor of simulation theory now called prompt theory. And it just happened within the last few months. And it's basically prompting these videos that look so realistic that you think they're actually real characters. And I showed it at a conference recently, and I said, this is AI, and people would still come up to me afterwards and say, was that really AI, or were those actual actors voicing those lines? That is part of getting to that simulation point, is having AI generate these worlds for you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Dean Takahashi. I'm a tech journalist. Been covering Silicon Valley here for around 3 decades plus. And I'm also editorial director for GamesBeat. We used to be part of VentureBeat for 17 years, and I started it 17 years ago. And in April, we spun it out as an independent company. So we're just GamesBeat now. And very happy to be talking here with Rizwan Virk. He's the author of The Simulation Hypothesis. First came out in 2019 and is now out in its second edition here that he wrote more recently, because it just came out in July. So congrats on that. And now let me introduce you a bit more about Rizwan. He's an entrepreneur, a video games pioneer, a film producer, and venture capitalist. He's also a professor at Arizona State University and a founder of Play Labs at MIT. The second edition book is called The Simulation Hypothesis. An MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics all agree we are in a video game. So Riz, welcome, and let me start just by asking you to tell us more about yourself, and also what sort of led you down this road to this book.
Sure, thanks for the introduction, Dean. It's great to be here with all of you. As Dean mentioned, I was an entrepreneur for a while. That's actually how we know each other, because we were constantly reaching out to Dean to get him to write stories about our video game startups. But what really led me down this path was after I had sold my last video game company, I was visiting a startup in Marin County, and they had just built a virtual reality ping pong game. And if you remember, this was in 2016, the headsets were a lot bigger than they are now, and there were wires coming from the ceiling. So we used to joke that they were it was like having a toaster on your face. But I put on the headset and I started playing this VR ping pong game, and the graphics were terrible too. I mean, I think I have a screenshot of it in the book so you can see. But the responsiveness was so good. The physics engine that they implemented in this VR game was so good that for a moment my body forgot that I was in virtual reality. So much so that I instinctively tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to lean on the table. Of course, there was no table. I was in a room with wires and headsets, but there was an empty space. So the controller fell to the floor. I almost fell over. And that's when I did a bit of a double take. And I said, okay, how long would it take us to build something that was so immersive that we would forget, not just for a moment. I mean, obviously, I only forgot for a moment. I came to my senses pretty quickly. But that we would be convinced that the virtual world was the real world. And so that's how I got down this rabbit hole of simulation theory, because I began to think about building something like The Matrix. And in The Matrix, I'm sure you guys have all seen it or know about it if you haven't. It's interesting, I'll meet people these days that haven't seen it, but they still know the storyline. Particularly younger people at university, like the kids, will not have seen it. But they had basically a brain-computer interface, and then they had this virtual world that was extremely convincing. So I ended up trying to project forward today's technology to say, how long would it take us to get to this point where we can do that, which I call the simulation point. So it's a kind of technological singularity. It's a slightly different version of singularity than what we're used to thinking, which is superintelligence or humans merging with biology. But if you look at the term singularity, it was used in this technology context by sci-fi writer Vernor Vinge, who wrote a paper about the coming technological singularity. But he was borrowing the term from von Neumann, who was borrowing it from physicists who used the term, when something goes to infinity, and he called that a singularity. And he said a singularity is the point after which things will be very different for humanity because of the exponential growth of technology. And so I use it in that context. And then as I started to explore this further, I found that there was some philosophical arguments out there already. And we can get into those more if we want to, by a guy named Nick Bostrom from Oxford and a guy named David Chalmers from NYU, both philosophers who had written about this topic. And Bostrom in particular concluded that if any civilization ever got to that point, then we would already be inside something like the Matrix. And
the interesting thing that he just walked us through was how much you've had to read across many different disciplines to get to this knowledge, right? And there's physics in there, there's sci-fi, there's people who took sci-fi seriously as some kind of guideline for science, and the intersections that you're able to draw throughout this book, I think tells me why you went to MIT, right?
Well, there weren't too many people at MIT reading about religion and philosophy, so even there was a bit of an outlier. But you're right. In fact, I taught a class recently on this topic, and it was called Science Fiction, Religion, Philosophy, and Technology. And so it's about as interdisciplinary as you can get in an academic environment. And it's hard to place it. Like, where do you put it? In the engineering school, in social sciences, in philosophy, for that reason. But then as I started to explore the quantum physics, I realized that they were also telling us that the world isn't really real as we think of it. Like, this is not as physical as it appears to us. And then when I went and looked at what the religious scriptures were saying, particularly the mystics who started the religions, they were telling us something similar, that in fact, this is all some kind of a hoax. And so all of those things led me to draw these connections and to try to write this book in such a way that I included a lot about each of those areas. And sometimes my academic colleagues will on the scientific side, will give me grief for spending a whole section of the book talking about religion and mysticism and yogic experiences and shamanic experiences. And yet I'll get grief on the other side sometimes for trying to be so scientific about things. But that's part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, was to try to tie those together.
But taking us back to like 2016 a little, on my side, the way I saw some people behaving was very interesting. Like, I did an interview with Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games back then, and he started talking about, like, in a few years we're going to have the metaverse too, and we're also going to have these AR goggles or glasses that you're just put on your head, and it'll be like having a 120-inch TV in front of you, and so we wouldn't need big screens anymore. So that was in 2016 he said that. And Jensen Huang, also the CEO of NVIDIA, he was noting that AI was beginning to work as early as 2012, right? And because it was working, he basically said, I don't have time for science fiction anymore. I am science fiction, right? And so the intersection between tech and sci-fi has gotten extremely interesting.
Yeah, it has. And in fact, you mentioned the metaverse, and that was a few years before Facebook changed its name to Meta. And that was a science fiction vision that came out of Snow Crash, which was written by Neil Stephenson all the way back in 1992. In fact, Dean and I interviewed Neil on stage back in the fall. But there was also dystopic elements of that science fiction story. And as tech entrepreneurs and moguls, they try to often build the technology that they've read about in science fiction, but they don't always think about how will this affect society and what are some of the other aspects. But with the metaverse in particular, there has been this, what we call the sci-fi feedback loop. So what happens is science fiction ends up inspiring generations of technologists and scientists to try to build new products, and those products end up then influencing the next wave of science fiction. And then that influences the next wave of innovation. And with the metaverse in particular, you have Snow Crash was in 92, you had The Matrix in 99, But you also had, in between that time, the web came about and the internet came about, and Stevenson hadn't really envisioned it. But then in 2010, you had, in 28, there was a virtual world called Second Life. I don't know if anybody here has remember Second Life, or actually, yeah, a few people do, and played it. And it was very much a metaverse. They, in fact, used that term when they were building it at the Linden Lab. But then in 2010, the book Ready Player One came out.
From here, I think they were making it.
Yeah, that's right. They were very close by. But then when Ready Player One came out in 2010, or maybe it was 2011, I remember reading it and thinking, hey, this reminds me a lot of Second Life. And it turns out that was the case, that Ernest Cline had spent a lot of time within Second Life. So you see, like, one work of science fiction inspiring a product, which then inspires another work of science fiction. And of course, most people know about Ready Player One because of the movie, the Spielberg movie.
Yeah. And I remember going to the CES way back when, and people were talking about making tricorders, right? And they were inspired by Star Trek and Bones McCoy's, medical device that would just read whatever was wrong with you just by a little scan, right? We were just about there.
Well, there was so the X Prize put on a tricorder X Prize. I think Qualcomm sponsored it, but I mean, it wasn't for a full tricorder, but it was something like a tricorder. And I know one of the companies that I think they won, or they were one of the finalists for it. Yeah. But with the metaverse, one of the things I read about in the book is that as these virtual worlds get more realistic, the AI will be integrated into those. And so I was talking about the simulation point, and in this book I give a formal definition, which is when we can build a virtual world that's indistinguishable from the physical world, but also with AI characters that are indistinguishable from either characters being controlled by humans or from biological humans. And so I defined something called the metaverse Turing test in this book, because most people today think that we've passed the Turing test. At least, there have been different versions of the Turing test out there. But in this one, I talk about this idea that if you're in a virtual world and you have two avatars, one of which is controlled by a human and one of which is controlled by AI, and you can actually do things in the virtual world, like you can go on a roller coaster, you can fly around, you can go to dance club, you can kind of observe the behavior as well as what they say. Will you be able to tell the difference? And if you can't, then we'll have reached that point, which I don't think we're at yet, actually.
There was a game called Spy Party where you had to find, a human among all of the sort of robotic NPCs in a party, and you had to be a sniper to take out the spy at some point, and only through looking for something that was like human behavior could you tell.
Right, so it's like the reverse Turing test, right?
Yeah.
The human test, yeah.
But we're bringing up games a bit here, but why, you used the word video game in your title in a book about the simulation hypothesis? Why did you turn towards games as one of the sort of key, references or paths that could help explain, this simulation world, I guess?
Yeah, so a lot of other people who've written about this topic, I mentioned Nick Bostrom earlier, for example, they tend to focus only on the AI aspect of building a simulation. And this is why the simulation hypothesis is scary for some people, because they say, are you trying to say that we're all just AI? We're like soulless AI? And I like to draw the distinction that there's two versions or flavors of simulation theory. On the one side, there's the NPC version. And on the other side, there's the RPG version. And so NPC, for those who don't know, stands for non-player characters within games. They're basically the AI characters, or the characters that are controlled by code, whereas your character inside a video game is called an avatar that you control, which, interestingly enough, that term comes from Sanskrit. So avatar originally meant when a divine entity squeezes itself into a small human body. And the term was actually defined by a couple guys at Lucasfilm, not far from here, when they built one of the first MMORPGs, but not really massively multiplayer. It was just multiplayer. It was the Habitat. And they said when they were controlling their little 2D character on screen, because they were using Commodore 64s with dial-up lines, they said it kind of felt like they were squeezing themselves into the phone lines and into this little character on the screen. And so they ended up borrowing the term, from Sanskrit. So in a game, you have avatars and you have or player characters and you have NPCs. In the RPG version of the simulation hypothesis. It's closer to the Matrix version. RPG stands for role-playing game. And the idea there is in the Matrix, Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity, they all existed outside of the Matrix. And they had a character inside the Matrix, which looked just like them, which of course made it easier to film because you could use the same actor. Same with Ready Player One, they did the same thing. I call that like an identomorphic avatar, one that looks like you. But in that version, the simulation itself is more like a virtual reality, where we have put on virtual reality headsets and we're immersed inside of it. And those two are not mutually exclusive, because that's why I call it an access, because you can have 100% NPCs, which is like a simulation of a civilization that is just AI, or you can have 100% RPG, but in a game like World of Warcraft or any of these games out there, Minecraft, you will have your character, the player character, and you will have NPCs as well. And so you have a mix of the two. But that's kind of why I ended up using the video game idea, is because it's a metaphor in a sense. Now, when we talk about video games today, they're way more advanced than when I was a kid. And I used to play, and I think, Dean, you probably were in that generation as well. I used to play like the Atari system. We had Pac-Man, we had Space Invaders, we had Adventure, which was one of the first graphical adventure games where you could actually explore all of these things. But the basic idea, so if you look at the difference between video games then and now, when I talk about the world being an actual video game, we're talking about something much more advanced than what we have today. And we're talking orders of magnitude more advanced than what we would need to have today. And so I like that metaphor because it's a way for people to understand it, because gaming is become, you're at GamesBeat. Gaming has become one of the largest industries with more revenue than Hollywood box office and music combined as well. But for the next generation, they're used to spending time in games as avatar. Like my nephews, when they come home from school, and those of you who have kids will know this, they'll get on Fortnite with the same friends that they had in school. Like, whereas we used to go out and play ball. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but they're very comfortable with virtual relationships. And so that's part of the reason why I chose that as the metaphor for the simulation idea.
And then you give something away just by calling it a simulation hypothesis, right? Most people, when they've heard of this before, they've always heard the words simulation theory, right? And it does make me wonder, like, are you approaching this like it's a scientific intellectual exercise? Or do you really believe that we're all fake? We're all computer simulations or programs, right?
Well, that's one of the things that I added into this new edition of the book is an FAQ with these questions that I've gotten asked over the past few years since I've been talking about this subject. And part of the reason I wrote the second edition was because in 2019, when the first edition came out, I was projecting forward with AI, and we didn't even have ChatGPT back then. But yeah, that's one of the most frequent questions that I get asked. And the answer for me is it's both. It's both an intellectual exercise, but I also have come up with, as I've looked into the scientific side, and then I also pull in interesting tidbits from mystical experiences side and people that have had near-death experiences, et cetera. I actually think it's more likely than not. So I call it a hypothesis because we can't be 100% sure because we're inside the simulation. But we can look for indications that we may be inside something that's not quite real, that's fake. And so
this is where we're getting to Redditors, right? The folks who are obsessing over whether or not there's evidence for we're living in a simulation.
Right, yeah. And so, one of the areas that I was looking into was the so-called observer effect in quantum physics, and which more formally is called quantum indeterminacy. And this idea that you have two slits with the double slit experiment, and the light will, if it's a particle, it has to go through one or the other. But if it's a wave, it goes through both. And just how confusing that is as a concept. And eventually, using one interpretation of quantum mechanics, they say you have these different possibilities because the particle is in superposition. It has multiple possible positions, like Schrodinger's cat, which is both alive and dead until someone observes it. Now, common sense tells us, no, the cat is either alive or it's dead. It can't be both. It has to be one. We just haven't looked, so we don't know which one. But that's not what quantum mechanics has been telling us. It's been telling us that it's both alive and dead, which is pretty much the basic principle of quantum computing and qubits. But that was just such a weird result. And so I began to ask a question, well, why would we be in a universe where the observation, or depending on who you talk to and which interpretation, the measurement or the interaction of these particles, would cause it to look like a state where the cat is, now it's alive or now it's dead.
And this stuff really bugged Einstein, right? Because he wanted to understand and explain the world. And when the evidence fell outside of, the current understanding of the world, then he had to come up with some explanation for it and could not, right?
Right. So he said God doesn't play dice with the universe,
we're looking for evidence that there may be, evidence that we're living in a simulation, right? Yeah. So we can find some of that. But yeah, when the world does things that we can't explain, then it starts to make you think maybe there's another explanation to look for, I guess, intellectually, right?
Yeah, and that's what happened to me. And to me, this whole idea of the quantum probability wave collapsing sounded like an optimization effort. I mean, that's what we do in computer programs. The reason we can give you a 3D virtual world like a Fortnite or something is because we only need to render the pixels that your avatar can see. We don't have to render the whole world. Like in the game No Man's Sky, for example, they have 18 quintillion planets. We don't have to render all the pixels for all 18 quintillion planets. You couldn't do that, even with our computer power today. You only have to render that which is observed. And there's a technique that we use called lazy evaluation in computer science, which is you don't evaluate something unless it's needed. And to me, there were just so many parallels between these.
Like EA's racing games, right? There you look at a car that they have, and they've modeled it perfectly on the outside. But if you look in the inside of the car, there's nothing there.
Right.
Nobody ever sees it, right?
Yeah. And there are interpretations of quantum mechanics that say that that's the way that it works. There's others that say we're in a multiverse, which also makes more sense in a simulated environment as well. But in the end, people say, can we prove we're not in a simulation? And that's a difficult one, because if the simulation were perfect, there would be no glitches. And so there wouldn't be a way for you to prove that we're not. But just because we can't prove that something is not true doesn't mean we can't look for evidence that it is true. Like, I could make a statement and say, there are no asteroids anywhere in the universe. Okay, we're never going to be able to prove that that's the case, that there are no asteroids. But we can look for evidence of asteroids. And, scientists used to not think the asteroids are real. They used to think people who were reporting rocks falling from the sky were just idiot peasants, right? And it's an attitude that's continued today in science, and it turns out they were wrong because they had the wrong framework, And so if there's another framework, another way of thinking about things that could make things that don't fit in today make sense, then, we should at least look at it. And that's, I think, the point of this book is to really look at this in a more serious way than it has been done before.
And the simulation hypothesis, I guess, is really sort of suggesting, I guess, that there's evidence that's there that is, examples, I guess, of the better explanations for the world than what we have normally, I guess, right? And so what are some of these examples, I guess, like the near-death experience you brought up? It makes no sense in the medical world to have a near-death experience. Like even dreams don't make any sense, right? But they do make sense when you think, it's all a computer simulation, right? So what kind of connections do you see there, or what kind of evidence do you see?
Well, that's where, I focus a little bit on glitches and things that don't fit in. And the near-death experience is an interesting one because, you have people that are they have no brain signals at all, or their hearts are stopped, or they're under general anesthesia and they shouldn't be remembering anything. And they come back and they describe these experiences that are fairly coherent with a bunch of stages that are common across many people, such as you're floating above your body, you're going through a tunnel of light, you're met by a being of light. But then there's one piece of that really got me thinking about making a connection between this particular experience, as well as others like DMT and other things, but it's called the Life Review. And I first heard about it from a guy named Daniel Brinkley, who was struck by lightning. He's been clinically dead at least like 2 or 3 times at this point. So he keeps dying, but he keeps coming back.
There's another movie called Defending Your Life about this too.
Yes, that's right. And so with Albert Brooks, yeah. So what they describe, and he described it as a holographic panoramic review of your entire life. So he had to go back and he had to watch everything that he'd ever done. But the trick is he wasn't watching it from his perspective. He had to see what it was like to be the other people in his life. And he was a bit of a bully, so he used to beat kids up. And then in Vietnam, he was literally an assassin. I mean, he shot people, and he had to experience what it was like emotionally too, not just visually, being shot by him, and then what happened to that person's families, and what happened, to their kids, et cetera. And that experience changed him. And then, he came back and said, well, now he treats people very differently than he did. Now, why is that linked to the simulation hypothesis? Because it reminds me very much of another VR experience that I had back in that same year. I was involved with a startup where we would take a video game that had been played, like League of Legends, and we would go back into that game, and you would put on a VR headset, and we could put you at any XYZ coordinate in that game. So you'd be looking around, and you would now actually be on the battlefield. And there was a game called CSGO, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is a first-person shooter. So you could literally see what it was like to be shot by your character. Now, obviously, our games today don't record emotions. You can't experience what it was like. You can't look at the ripple effect. But as a computer scientist, I said, my inclination is to say, okay, well, if this is true, and thousands of people are reporting it, just like if thousands of people say they've been to China, okay, some of them may have differences. Some people went to mountains, some people went to Shanghai, some people went to Shenzhen. They're going to see different things. But for the most part, we can conclude that there is something there called China, rather than simply dismissing it. But even if we just take the conceit and say, okay, if this is true, how could it be done? How would that work? Well, what it means is we would have to record everything that is happening within our world. And then we would have to be able to replay it from any avatars.
Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like a video game. Right?
Sounds like a video game, exactly. Yeah. And and you know this, Dean, probably the most popular content on YouTube is actually replays of video game sessions where you're just watching somebody play the game. And I remember a time when one of my nephews, he was like 3, and he said to his father, my brother, he said, oh, I want to watch Star Wars. And he said, oh, you want to watch the Star Wars movie? He said, no, I want to watch the man and the woman play that Star Wars game. Right? So you wanted to watch a replay of the video game session of this 3D world that had been recorded. And so, that's where I start to draw the connections to say that, in fact, if we were in a virtual reality, this would actually make more sense than if we were in a physical world, because there's no mechanism for that kind of a thing.
And then there's Eastern religion connections here too, right? In a video game, you get lives, you get multiple lives, you're reborn again after you die. You try to sort of go on to the next level, but somehow you might be on a Groundhog Day sort of experience, right? Again, it reminds you that, say, Eastern religions also are a bit more able to explain some of these strange anomalies, but they're also just like video games, right?
Yeah, very much. And that's why, I put the Eastern mystics into the subtitle, although when I got into it, I found it wasn't just the Eastern religions, also the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Western religions. If you go to the mystical traditions within each of these religions, that's where you find the commonality. Now, in the Eastern religions, they have this concept of Maya, or illusion, and that's usually how it's translated, is illusion. But if you look at what some of the scholars say, they say it's like a carefully crafted illusion. And this is part of the key tenets of both Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, that the world is a kind of illusion. But they kind of describe it almost like a magic show. So if you came here not to watch Dean and I talk, but you came to watch a magician up here, they might be sawing a woman in half. Now, you might know that he's not really sawing that woman in half, but you want to believe it. That's part of the fun of the thing, is to basically set aside your disbelief. And in the Eastern traditions, Maya is actually defined in that kind of a way that you choose to enter Maya, the illusion, and you have a set of quests. Well, I call them quests and achievements, which come from your karma. Where is the karma stored? Well, it's not in the physical world, right? I can't look around and say, where's my karma? But there is some information somewhere that is being used to basically, create these situations in your life. There's a story, if I could tell a quick story in the Hindu traditions, of Vishnu trying to explain what Maya is. And those of you who've seen The Matrix will recognize this kind of a story, where Narada, who was this proud sage seeking enlightenment, says to the god Vishnu, I want to know what Maya is. And the god Vishnu says, I can't tell you what Maya is. I can't explain it to you. I have to show you. And he says, okay, here, step into this pool of water. So Narada steps into the pool of water, and suddenly he's a little baby girl named Sushila, who's a princess of Benares in India. And Sushila goes through her whole life. She grows up as a princess. She marries the prince from the neighboring kingdom. She moves there, and then there's a big war between her husband's kingdom and her father's and her brothers, and they all kill each other. And of course now Sushila is very sad because her husband and brothers, father, and even her sons at this point, they're all killed. And so she walks out of town very kind of desolate, and she sees this pool of water, and she's gonna throw herself in this pool of water. And as soon as she does, she's back with the god Vishnu, and she's now the sage Narada. And Vishnu says, now you understand what Maya is. It's basically the power of illusion to make you believe that this world is reality. And that, of course, echoes Morpheus' line in The Matrix, where he says, I can't explain what the Matrix is. I have to show you what the Matrix is, particularly if you're ensconced within it. So these ideas are there in the Eastern religions as kind of part and parcel, but turns out they're there in other religions as well. And so what happens is mystics have this experience. Most religions start because of what scholars might call a theophany, where somehow the divine breaks through into the physical world, like burning bush talks to Moses, an angel appears to Muhammad, or Jesus goes out in the desert, or through yogic techniques or shamanic techniques, somebody peeks outside the physical world and comes back and tries to explain it, kind of like with Plato's cave. How do they explain it? They have to use metaphors. Because there's no way to describe these things. And so what do? They use technological metaphors. Like the wheel of samsara, that's not a real wheel. That's a technological metaphor trying to explain this idea of multiple lives going back and forth. And so you see this throughout the religious traditions. And even in Islam, for example, there is a whole series of verses that say that this is el-gururi matao, which means a delusion, but an enjoyable delusion. But enjoyable doesn't mean it's fun, but they're using it, and they use the metaphor of a game. It's a type of game or a sport. Now, when we play games, like Grand Theft Auto or whatever, it's not like everything is pleasant in those games. I mean, people die, people get shot, all these things happen within the games. But they try to use the metaphors, and I think it's what religious leaders try to do sometimes is update the metaphor. So there was a guy named Swami Yogananda who wrote...
I did want to go down one more path, so if you could wind that part.
Yeah. So there was a guy named Swami Yogananda who came from India to the U.S. about 100 years ago. He wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, which was Steve Jobs' favorite book, and they gave it out as a memorial service. And he tried to update these old metaphors of Maya and the dream world. And he used the latest technology of the time. He said, what Maya is it's like a film projector, and we're actually on the screen, and the actors are behind the characters, and the characters are dying and they're suffering, but the actors necessarily aren't. So my point there is just that he tried to use a new metaphor, and if he were alive today, I think he would say that it's like a movie, but we're the actors, we're also the audience, we have a script, and we can change it. And what does that sound like? It sounds like we're in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. So that's where I ended up drawing the connections to all of these religious ideas.
Yeah. And then back in 2020, there was this survey by YouGov that found that 50% of all Americans believe it's at least somewhat likely that we live in a simulation. And then we've heard people like Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Elon Musk all say that the chances that we're in a simulation are very likely, I guess, right?
Yeah, some of them said 50-50, some
Yeah.
of them said 51-49, but Elon Musk said it's 1 in billions that we're in base reality, which means it's billions to 1 we're in a simulation.
And I do wonder too, like if you see then the connection to politics as well, right? I mean, this notion of fake news, right? That we can say deny the evidence of our senses that this, this world is real or unreal. If you depoliticize this, like what is this really about? That like we're starting to doubt the evidence of our senses, and there can be consequences to this. Like, I mean, there could be very bad consequences to doubting, say, science, right, in the middle of something like a pandemic, right? What connection do you see between the simulation hypothesis and this other kind of disbelief?
Right. Well, so I kind of like to think of this as two different levels of abstraction. And so there's the hard simulation hypothesis, which is what my book is about, which is about the idea that the physical world actually consists of information, and that information gets computed and rendered for us, like in a video game. Then there's what I like to call the soft simulation hypothesis, which gets more into these types of issues. And I don't write about that in this book, but people have borrowed the terms from the Matrix. For example, like red pill is a term that's used, particularly within what we consider more right-wing type environments, or someone has been red pilled. But I think within that, what you're seeing is a movement of distrust of authority, but it's not just a left-wing or a right-wing thing. I think it started, with the Iraq War, which happened just a couple of years after the Matrix. And, you had the left doubting what the right was saying about weapons of mass destruction. And then later, you had other things going on with Wall Street, and then you have so many things happening that I think there's this element that of what's called the narrative matrix. And the narrative matrix is, should we believe everything that we've been told? And the problem with that is that there are, in fact, conspiracies, right? And, for example, you had Representative Luna on Joe Rogan today, and she's in charge of the committee that's investigating the JFK files. And she said there was a conspiracy. We have evidence that there were multiple shooters, but we don't want to believe that. And so the term conspiracy theory is tossed around as a way to make people look crazy that might believe in anything than the official narrative. But I do agree with you that we need to be careful with that, because it's gotten into, like, NPC has been used as a derogatory term online, which is somebody who repeats what they've been told by the media. But I think there's a balance between believing everything we're told, and believing nothing that we're told. And I think that's where we have to discriminate. Yes, we did land on the moon, I think, right? But that doesn't mean that everything we've learned about the history is exactly the way that it's presented to us, because the people in power are always presenting stories. So that's, I think, where that comes in. Again, I don't talk so much about this in my book, but it's an interesting area. Maybe I need to write another one called the soft simulation hypothesis.
Yeah. I like this notion of sort of things that can be considered evidence of glitches, I guess. And do you want to take us back to Philip K. Dick a little? I guess.
Yeah.
Even before the Matrix, this was a thing, right? And he was really the one that sort of gave birth to this almost paranoid notion that there is no world. Right. Yeah,
well, he inspired this idea through many of his works. And during the writing of this book, I actually interviewed his wife, Tessa V. Dick. And she pointed me towards a speech he gave in Metz, France in 1977. It was at a sci-fi conference. And there's a famous line from that, which some of you may have heard, where he says, "We are living in a computer-programmed reality." And then they cut to the audience to see how they reacted. Now remember, this is 1977, right? Personal computers aren't even a thing, right? Atari home system hasn't even been invented. And you see people looking at them in disbelief, like, what the heck are you talking about? You must be crazy. Right? But it was during that time that a number of scientists were starting to explore this idea that computation and computer programs could be the basis of the physical world. I did an event in Boston recently where we screened The Matrix, and this woman introduced herself to me, and she said, I'm the wife of Ed Fredkin. And Fredkin was an MIT professor who was pioneering this idea of digital physics and computer programs and stuff. But anyway, if you go to that speech and you listen to Philip K. Dick's speech, basically he was saying that after he says we're living in a computer programmed reality, he said the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality. So I don't know if anybody here has seen The Man in the High Castle, which is based on a book by Philip K. Dick, or The Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon and Emily Blunt. So those are all both based on Philip K. Dick stories like Minority Report. But Tessa told me that he came to write those because he felt like he had this weird intuitive sense that somehow people were changing history, like they were changing things. And the adjustment team is all about that idea. And so anyway, that idea ended up inspiring the Wachowskis. And so I asked his wife, what would Philip K. Dick think of The Matrix? And she said, well, his first reaction would be, this is great. I love this movie because it's taking these ideas that I have and putting them into a real cool story. And his second reaction would be to call his agent to see if he could sue them to get some credit for the ideas.
We got some good questions here. I'm going to sort of kind of randomly go through some there. Let's see. Descartes talks a lot about the differences between animals and humans, citing reason as the distinction between them. Using the same argument of reason, how can we distinguish the difference between AI reason and human reason?
That's a good question, and that's something that we're, I think, struggling with right now as an industry. And you have these predictions of the singularity is going to happen. It's been brought forward now every few years, and AGI is coming next year for the past few years. Right now, I think they're saying next year. Some are saying we've already reached AGI, but I don't think that's necessarily the case, right? Because LLMs have issues in how they do things. The LLMs and neural networks, of course, are based on the idea of the perceptron, which was modeled after a very simplistic view of a neuron and how it worked. And I think neuroscientists now understand more about how neurons work. And so that original understanding, wasn't quite right, but it was still a viable model for computation. And so we're in the second great wave of AI. And the first big wave happened in the 80s. It was all about rules and expert systems. And if you look at the work of guys like Marvin Minsky and others, like when I was in school, we learned about neural nets, but we also learned about these rule-based systems. And so originally they thought they could define rules for everything like computer programs to model the brain. And then now we have big data and neural networks and machine learning, which is all based on data. But even LLMs can't necessarily today, if you say how many R's are in the word strawberry, they don't necessarily get it right because they're just trying to predict the next word. And they're saying this is the most likely next word. But that said...
Are AI's hallucinations glitches?
They could be, right? Because they're coming up with these ideas of what should be there. I remember the first time this happened to me was in the class I was teaching, and a student turned in a paper that had like 3 references. And the first one was Nick Bostrom simulation paper. The second one was my book. And I'm like, okay, those are reasonable. And the third reference was this paper about religion and the simulation hypothesis. And I thought, well, that's odd. I've never heard of this paper. And I'm an expert in this topic. I'm even writing about religion and simulation. And turns out it was a complete hallucination, including the DOI, which is like a URL for this paper. And it was a real professor's name in a real journal. And we actually emailed the professor to say, hey, did you ever write this article? We can't find it anywhere online. And he said no. And the guy had used ChatGPT for it. And so, that was the kind of hallucinations that you get. But what's happening now is that the AI is starting to write code. Like I asked a math problem recently to one of these AIs, and it got it right. And I'm like, how did it get it right if it can't even figure out, how many R's are in strawberry? And then I asked it, what was your reasoning? And it actually wrote some Python code. And then it ran the code, and that's how it got the right answer. And so now you're starting to see a mixture between the LLMs, the data-based approach, and the rule-based approach. That said, in the NPC version of simulation, some people would say, you can't tell the difference from the outside. In the RPG version, we would say that you can, because there is an animating player from beyond that actually has free will beyond the system itself. So that's why I draw that distinction sometimes, and why I think sometimes some people get scared by the NPC version. Oddly enough, I was on a couple of podcasts with some very left-brain scientific types. They hated the RPG version because that would mean that some of the stuff that religion said might be true. And so they were offended by that. So, you can get scared by either side, I guess.
So I guess when the AI writes the program for the metaverse, then I guess that's the singularity point you're talking about then.
It would be required to do that, right? Because how would you generate an entire world like this? If you think of the holodeck on Star Trek: The Next Generation, I'm sure there's some sci-fi fans here who've seen it. It's like a room maybe this size, for those that don't know, where it can create any environment and it feels real, like these chairs would feel real, but they were created by the AI. And how do you program that holodeck, or how did they program it? Well, it turns out they just talked to the computer. And the computer actually generated the entire environment. They said, I want a street in Paris in 1890, and I'd like there to be a bartender and a couple of, a bunch of patrons, and, this woman in a red dress or whatever. And it would generate all of that. And before, we couldn't really think how to do that, because I remember thinking, well, that's not a program. A program is, but now we can with prompts. So there's a whole new flavor of simulation theory now called prompt theory. And it just happened within the last few months. And it's basically prompting these videos that look so realistic that you think they're actually real characters. But they're saying things like, I am definitely not a prompt. Or if you're on a date with a guy and he starts talking about prompt theory, forget that. Or we are not going to allow prompt theory to be taught in our schools. Or, we are not prompts. We are not prompts. And yet it looks so realistic that you're like, wow, those aren't. And I showed it at a conference recently, and I said, this is AI, and people would still come up to me afterwards and say, was that really AI, or were those actual actors voicing those lines? This was after Google VO3 was released. So, that is part of getting to that simulation point, is having AI generate these worlds for you.
Here's another question. Nicole Lazaro here asked, in the movie Inception, each character has a totem to tell if they are dreaming. Is there a tell or a test for whether or not we're living in a simulation, a Turing test for simulation?
Well, there could be, and that's why I also write about glitches. So there's different ways to try to tell. One is to look at this idea of information and computation. And so there's actually 4 propositions that I'm saying here. One is that the world isn't physical, it's built on information. And turns out that's not so controversial anymore. I met a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at the University of Cambridge last year, and he said, that would have been controversial 30 years ago, but it's not. We used to learn about conservation of energy and momentum, and now we learn about conservation of information. The second is that information gets computed on a regular basis. And then you have people like Stephen Wolfram with their idea of automatons and programs working on that. The third is somehow this information, the bits, get rendered for us, and they look real. Now, that's controversial as in terms of how does that happen, we don't know. I'm proposing that it's like a simulation with an observer in a video game. And then the fourth is that the whole thing is some kind of purposeful hoax. But if you see glitches in the Matrix, whether it's deja vu, so Philip K. Dick, if you read the rest of the speech, he goes, we would have the sense of reliving the same events and saying the same things, but something's different. So you could look for glitches. Or the term synchronicity, which was coined by Jung, which is when something you're thinking corresponds with something in the outside world. Now, synchronicity is, he defined it as an acausal connection. But if you think of a technological infrastructure, you could again define something that seems weird or nonsensical. So for example, I'll tell a quick story. I was shopping for a backpack online, a specific backpack. I went to the website and I added it to my cart. And then I was on my phone on like Facebook or something, and I see an ad for that exact backpack. Now, if I was prone to magical thinking and I knew nothing about computers, I'd be like, wow, how did that happen? I was just thinking of buying the backpack, and now it's here. And if I was scientifically minded, but I didn't know anything about computers, I would say, that's nonsense, it's a coincidence. There's no meaning behind that. But if you know about cookies and advertising databases, we used to literally call it registering your intent when we would put your ID in that database, and then it's used. So you can look for glitches, I think, personally, at things that are dismissed by scientists as coincidence and are embraced by others as magical thinking, and say, wait, would an information-based structure make more sense here? I think,
So if we are in a simulation, what is our obligation on how we should behave?
That's a good question. And I mean, now we're back in metaphysical territory. And this is partly why I draw the distinction between the two versions of the simulation hypothesis. In the NPC version, you would think, well, we have no obligation to anybody, we can do whatever we want. But of course, in the NPC version, you would never run a simulation just once, you would run it again. So every possibility might be explored, like a multiverse. In the RPG version, you're there as a character, but you're there to play with other characters. And so when we play video games, we often choose our character and we choose a storyline. And like when I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, back in the day before we had a lot of video games, we would have a character sheet and we would say, this is the race, and this is an elf, and I'm going to be a wizard or a thief. And then you would roll these dice and you'd have all the different attributes, strength, charisma, intelligence, all these things. And some of them would be random, but some of them would be a key part of that storyline. And then the storyline would be, we're going to go on this particular adventure, and you'd make up a backstory. And so if we're in this video game and we've chosen our characters, we may have a storyline that we're here to do. Like if you had asked me in high school, what are you going to do with your life? I would have said, I want to be a software entrepreneur and then a writer and maybe a professor. And, in the end, I did end up doing all those things. But what was it that made me, and not necessarily my siblings who had pretty much similar genetics and similar upbringing, want to do those specific things? Is it a part of the storyline? Now, again, if you want to look at how a game is evaluated, that might give you a clue as to how to act. And I don't think the game we're in is Grand Theft Auto, where we're out to just abuse everybody else. And that's why I brought up the life review as a virtual recording. Because what is it that the life review tells us? It says you're going to have to see and experience what the game was like from the other players. So I think that gives us an obligation to consider other people. But also, sometimes we have difficulties in our lives, relationship difficulties, physical difficulties, financial difficulties, health problems, suffering in various ways, and we have choices to make. But by thinking of the world as a video game, we can view those as a kind of quest, where the difficulty level has been cranked up. And there's a rule in the video game industry that came from Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari, and he said, make the game easy to play but difficult to master. And because if it's too easy to master, you're going to stop playing pretty quickly. And if it's too difficult to play, same thing. And so if we get difficult situations, what caused me to write this book was when I went through a pretty major health crisis. I ended up having heart surgery. And while I was recovering, I remembered the storyline that you could have asked me about in high school. And I thought I was going to switch from being a software entrepreneur to a writer at a very old age of 28, because I was in high school and I thought that was old. But I was 48 at this point, and I was still involved in video games and investing and making money. And I realized that part of the gem of this particular ordeal, and it was an ordeal. It's 6 years later, and I'm barely recovered from this ordeal, was that it got me into this path of writing as a way to kind of put me on a different storyline. Every time I tried to jump back...
Your idea of relaxing is to write books like this, right?
Exactly, yeah. But every time I tried to jump back in, say, into a company in Silicon Valley or do more VC stuff, I would end up back in the hospital. But I had just enough energy to go to Starbucks and write for a couple hours a day, and it gave me energy as opposed to taking energy away. It was just a weird...
Here's kind of a question that relates to some of that. And I think I actually have my own answer on some of this one. But I understand that you meditate. If the world is a simulation, what is the purpose of meditation?
Well, let's hear your answer first then on this one.
I think meditation resets you, right?
Yeah.
And so you can sort of start another life, I guess, or start another set of your experience. And so this notion of starting over, meditation seems like it plays this role of, getting you on to the next video game character that you're going to be.
Yeah, it could be. So if you look at meditation itself and how it's defined in the yogic traditions, we draw the distinction between yoga as physical exercises and meditation as kind of a mental thing that we do where you're watching your thoughts. But if you go back, that wasn't the case. I mean, they were kind of all intertwined, the 8 limbs of yoga, only one of which are the asanas, which every yoga studio here in the West teaches you. But if you look at the actual definition of yoga from Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras, he says, yogash chitta vrittis naroda. And now what that means is yoga is the cessation, naroda, of the chitta vrittis. And say, okay, well, what the heck are the chitta vrittis? Chitta means mind stuff, and vrittis means whirlpools. And basically, every time you think of something and you get excited, you create these little whirlpools. And he said what yoga and meditation are about is stopping all of these thoughts and whirlpools in consciousness. And so you reach a stillness. So if you're a player that's immersing yourself in the world, and you have forgotten that you're a player, and you think you are the character, you're getting lots of sensory inputs. Right? And so in meditation, part of the goal is to relax the attention on those inputs and ask yourself what's beyond that. So it's almost a way of remembering. So that's how I view meditation relating to the simulation hypothesis. It's kind of like taking the red pill in a sense, in that you're forgetting about the physical world so you can remember, so that when you go back into the world, you have a different perspective. And if you do any yoga or meditation...
The answer is a little more complicated than mine.
But if you do yoga or meditation, you'll realize there's something is stilled at the end. Like if you've ever done like Shavasana, where you lay back in the corpse pose, or what I like to call the peaceful pose. Something is stilled. What is it that's stilled? Right? And that's, I think, the information that's around us in our fields all the time. Anyway, that's my perspective on it.
So here's another, is human culture predetermined? Are interactions and thoughts ever really original?
That's a good question. And I think I'll answer it by going back to this NPC versus RPG distinction. And as I said, the term NPC is used kind of derogatorily online, particularly within some far-right forums and places like that. But if you think of free will, in the NPC version, technically there's no free will because it's just code running. It's a deterministic process. But that said, just because it's deterministic doesn't mean you're going to know how it ends. I've mentioned Stephen Wolfram, and he defined this term called computationally irreducible. And he said, basically, you don't know what's going to happen at step 2 million of this process, if it's a complex process, until step 1,999,999, and you don't know what's going to happen there until the previous. So you have to run it. So he was defining free will in the sense that you don't know what's going to happen unless you run the whole process in the simulation. In the RPG version, you have more free will because you are taking it outside of the system. You have a player that maybe has some goals and some quests that they're after. There's something in the middle that I've been playing with called NPC mode, which is when we're all just reacting based on, like an LLM. Like an LLM can only tell you what it's been trained on, generally speaking. I mean, it'll hallucinate some things. But when we're in NPC mode, I think we're just regurgitating what we have been trained on in this life. But when we're not in NPC mode, we may be getting inspiration and doing things that are original. But it's interesting that sometimes multiple people will have the same invention or the same idea, or the Native Americans would say that the stories are stalking the storytellers. So like the storytellers exist outside of the physical world, and they're following people until they can get in and get the people inspired. So I think we can have original thoughts, but I think we might also have storylines in our lives. And within those storylines, we have much flexibility in how we do things.
So if life is a simulation, why would a simulation be something like a 9-to-5 job and not more video game like? Like, why isn't life more fun?
Well, it depends on your definition of fun. So I mentioned earlier, we talked about the metaverse, and I mentioned Second Life, and there was at least one person, I think, who had played. Now, this was a virtual world. It wasn't a video game per se, in that you didn't go in and you were fighting orcs. I mean, you could basically do anything you wanted to. But people were living a virtual life, and they had a virtual house, and they had virtual jobs. And I remember acting kind of like a virtual anthropologist. I'd go walk around in this virtual world and ask people, why do you do this? And they would literally come home from their 9-to-5 job, and then they would log into Second Life, and they would have a second job, which is a bartender. And they would be paid peanuts, like in Linden dollars at the time. This is before BTC. And I was like, well, why would you do that? It's because they wanted to, that experience was somehow fulfilling to them. And they would have a relationship or be married in the real world, and then they would be married to somebody else in the virtual world. And so, our definition of fun and what is a game, I think depends on that. But sometimes I think part of the experience itself is to not know what to do. And so that I think is part of it. We may have big challenges, but we may have mundane challenges. In a lot of video games, you have what's called grinding, where you're just trying to get through all of these, levels, these ordinary tasks, so you can get to the next level.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But people often say to me, look, I know this isn't a video game because if it was, then I would be a billionaire. I would be a movie star. I would be all these things. And I say that's interesting because in The Matrix, in the first version of The Matrix, Agent Smith tells Morpheus it was a perfect world and everything was great and you had no challenges and you didn't have to have a job. He goes, the human mind didn't accept that as real. So it was like we needed the struggle in order to convince ourselves that the game is real. Otherwise, we'd probably just get bored after a while.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So if our shared experiences are derived from the material conditions that surround us, to what extent do you think will become echo chambers of what chat boxes tell us?
I think we are in some cases. I wrote an article a few years ago for CNN about censorship online. And my worry wasn't that there wasn't censorship. I mean, there was already censorship online with Google and YouTube, et cetera. And it tended to lean more left, so they were censoring more the right, but you could still find stuff. I mean, you could still go to the second page or third page or fourth page if you really wanted to. But with AI, you have almost a perfect censorship mechanism because it's only going to give the answer that it computes, and it's not going to tell you about the other answers. Now, you can, if you keep poking it, and like a lot of my students, especially younger people, I mean, they just look at what the AI says, and that's it. They don't even go beyond that. So you could, I mean, imagine if this was during the Iraq War. What would it tell us? It would tell us, oh, so many authorities have told us that there are weapons of mass destruction, and that's why we absolutely have to go there, or whatever your leanings are, right? Think of it on the flip side too. So I think we, in many ways, can become echoes of what the LLMs are telling us, but the LLMs are basically echoes of kind of an average of what we've written out there.
I think it's somehow like the notion that I get about how to live or how to be in this kind of uncertainty is to just shift your perspective some and see things in another way, right? And I think of the Vietnam War and say the war correspondents who are going into the field in Vietnam and concluding that the United States is in trouble here, we're not winning this war, right?
Yeah.
And they send their dispatches back to Washington, D.C., and there are people sitting in desks in New York and Washington that are making judgments about how to edit these pieces that are coming in. And they check with their sources in the Pentagon, and the Pentagon tells them, we're winning this war, right? And then all of a sudden those dispatches are converted from sort of this pessimism towards optimism. And, those people needed to shift their perspective. And the consequences of failing to do so were just enormous for the United States.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. You know, shifting perspective is a good thing. I think being discerning is another thing. So, like in academia, like in normal life, we use Wikipedia a lot, but in academia, you can't reference Wikipedia. Why not? And generally speaking, Wikipedia is pretty good. I mean, you get 80% of what you need to get there, but they want you to go back to the original sources because of the way that it might have been edited or what's left out or things that are wrong or political bias or anything. And so I think we just have to be discriminating and we have to shift our perspective, like you said, when it comes to that.
And in closing, do you have a comment? We got about a minute left. Anything you also still want to get across?
Well, I would just say that I think, as I've said earlier, that people in ancient times were also trying to deal with this thing that we call life, and they were trying to come up with explanations for how things worked, and they turned to God and angels. And today we turn to physics and science to try to figure out what's going on. But really, I think we need to have a merger of philosophy, religion, and science to try to figure out what's going on and what the bigger picture is. And the video game, I think, is the best and latest metaphor for that. And whether you're over here on my axis of, is this just a metaphor or are we really living in a physical simulation? You can be in either of those extremes, and I think it's still a valuable discussion to consider, something about the physical universe around us and what it might all mean. Yeah.
So thank you to Rizwan Virk, author of The Simulation Hypothesis. He'll be signing books in a few moments outside the lobby. For more information about membership or upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.com. I'm Dean Takahashi at GamesBeat. Thank you and good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.